influenza since 1918 right up to the present. Can I just double check that the sound is okay at the back? Super. As you will see at the end of the lecture, sound is a very important component of today's lecture. Today's lecture looks at the toll and its consequences in South Africa. Yesterday I sketched the impact, the way in which the epidemic reached South Africa, the way in which it fanned out across the country, and the devastating impact on communities both urban and rural. And I ended by saying it really was a disaster of unprecedented size and magnitude for the country, such as it had never known before and has not yet had something parallel to that in terms of intensity, short duration, and intense, very high mortality rate. And in looking at the toll, that's the path that today's lecture is going to follow. To begin with, can we explain this enormously high toll in South Africa, the third or the fourth worst hit country in the world? And then from there, I want to look at the consequences, a range of consequences, demographic, social, religious, commercial, health, and political. And that at the end, I want to at least reflect a little on memory of the epidemic, or lack of memory of the epidemic. And that's, I did promise you on Monday, I have a surprise in store for you. There, in fact, are two surprises in store for you, but I will just pique your curiosity, but do no more. So, some 300,000 South Africans died in the epidemic. That's about 6% of the entire population. How do we at least try and explain the severity of the epidemic in South Africa? I think there probably are at least three major reasons, and some of those I've already hinted at, or indeed more than hinted at, in yesterday's lecture. The first was the well-developed railway system, quite far more developed than anywhere else in Africa. And there are deep-rooted reasons for that in the nature of the South African economy and the importance of migrant labour. So that by 1918, South Africa had a very well-developed railway system, an extensive rail system branching well beyond just the main cities, but deep into rural areas from which migrant labour came. That's one element. The second element is that in 1918, and indeed even before, South Africa had an unusually large number of young men on the move. The two major components were, of course, in 1918, soldiers, but that's not all that different from many other countries. But added to that in South Africa, and that makes it very distinctive, a large number of young male migrant workers on the move. And so, given the high incidence of flu, particularly amongst young adults, and the way in which flu was carried, individuals from one to the other, sneezes and coughs, that's the second very important. A large number of young men on the move, usually clustered in railway coaches. The third reason is again something to which I have alluded, and that is for the way in which the epidemic hit South Africa, except in what was then Natal and the Witwatersrand, where that first wave, which was very infectious but not all that lethal, where that first wave hit, the second wave, the deadly wave, came in from Cape Town and swept up the west and part of the north, which meant that the first exposure of those parts of South Africa was not to the first wave with the immunity which it conferred, but to the deadly second wave. So I think the three reasons relate very much to the railway system, the very high number of young men on the move, and thirdly, the fact that for a large component of South Africa, their first exposure to the epidemic was to the second wave. This begins to be confirmed if we look at the pattern pattern of mortality in South Africa. That's what this map does. It literally goes from areas where the mortality was more than 35 per thousand, that's 3.5%, slightly lighter shading, 21 to 35 per thousand, and blank, 1 to 20. And what you can see is a very marked pattern of the most heavily affected areas being up from the west, down into the southeast of South Africa, what is today the Eastern Cape. Up the west, there is Kimberley is there. Kimberley's there, and on that western border, and then a little in the southern Free State, and up in the far north. The figures on which this map is based are not absolutely exact or precise. So this is of an order of mortality. But the pattern is very clear that in some areas, particularly Natal, the key areas, a central part of what was then the Transvaal, the very far west areas on the west coast, mortality was relatively light. If we then take this map, if you can take a mental snapshot and impose on this map the railway map of South Africa, you will see that there is a close correlation. The major routes going up from Cape Town through De Aar. De Aar was one of the worst hit places, a major railway junction. And then Kimberley, and then up the west. And then lots of railway lines going down into what was the Transkei and Ciskei and the Eastern Cape, particularly because those are the recruiting areas for migrant labourers. Those railway lines penetrated into the most distant, most remote parts of South Africa. So I think that what we have here is a classic example of what epidemiologists call a railway epidemic, an epidemic which went along the railway lines, and indeed contemporaries picked this up. I found in the archives a huge railway map of South Africa compiled by the railway department, and on it they put the date of the first reported outbreak of the epidemic in each town, and you can just follow it inexorably along the line, coming particularly from Cape Town and going up that line. Almost 2 days, 3 days later, the next town, the next junction, and somewhere like De Aar, where several lines intersected, as I said, was horrific, the mortality. And so if we take what I started with by saying the western part of the country, which was infected from Cape Town with the second wave, and the eastern part of the country infected, it would seem, by first wave, that begins to make sense of that differential pattern of mortality. And so, paradoxically, you might say that the best defense against mortality in the second wave was a bout of first wave mortality. It bestowed a degree of immunity, and that's apparent in the relatively light mortality in Natal, in parts of the northern Free State and the then Transvaal. And if we compare mortality in cities, this confirms it. In Durban, the mortality was less than 1%. In Johannesburg, the mortality was similarly less than 1%. In Cape Town, the mortality was 6 to 7%. In Kimberley, it was up at 9% of the population. So what you have got here is the differential impact of the epidemic. It suggests very strongly the differential impact was a function of whether you were exposed to first wave or not. If we look then beyond the immediate impact at the demographic impact of the flu, as I mentioned already on Tuesday when I was talking globally, it's not enough to focus just on the 300,000 who died in South Africa. The implications of their death went well beyond their individual death. Clearly, that's the first focus, that's the most tragic focus, that's the one that our eyes are attracted to. But we also need to bear in mind some consequential deaths or consequences of these deaths. The first, as I mentioned on Tuesday, was the death of a large number of pregnant women, which meant the loss of their still-to-be-born babies. And indeed, within African communities in South Africa, this raised quite an issue of whether a mother-to-be who died in the flu, pregnant with the first child, whether lobolo for her should be repaid or not, because she had not borne the first child of that family. Quite a number of debates and discussions about that, and that's one of the implications. But also, as I think I mentioned on Tuesday, we should consider the effect of a pregnant woman contracting the flu but not dying of the flu, but the effect of the flu on the fetus, stillbirth, abortion, miscarriage. Consequently, one has a distinct dent in the age pyramid of South Africa, a dent of children who should have been born at the end of 1918 and the first 6 months of 1919, but were not. And on Tuesday, I referred to one of the, in a sense, the echo of this. In 1925, the Superintendent General of Education in the Cape said, strange, admissions to sub-A this year are down significantly. What happened? Well, what happened? Work backwards. They were meant to be 6 years old. It's the children who should have been born in 1919 and were not born. And so, come the first stage of education, they were not there. We should also bear in mind, again, just to refresh your memory, to the impact on newly created widows and widowers, those who had to cope with a breadwinner having suddenly died. Many of them forced to move from their homes they could no longer afford. Many, particularly widows, now forced to go out and work. And indeed, I had accounts from quite a number of people who said, my mother had to leave school because she had to go out and work. The family could no longer sustain a young woman remaining in school. She had to go out and work because her mother had suddenly been widowed. Another major consequence, and of course here there is a parallel with HIV/AIDS, the creation of probably, within the space of 2 to 3 weeks, 900,000 orphans in South Africa. A tragic, poignant photograph of 3 flu orphans. Their mother, they lived down in Noordhoek, their mother died, and these were the 3 orphans left. And they represent the 900,000 odd orphans, flu orphans, created so rapidly by the epidemic. And again, those personal interviews which I conducted generated very, very sad stories. Here's one. My 4 brothers and sisters were scattered. I was taken in by relatives, but they were taken in by others. We never got together again. So a family literally fragmented and shattered for all times. All the siblings farmed out to different members of the family. And that we can multiply many, many, many times over. In most African, Indian and coloured families, such orphans were usually incorporated into the larger extended family. but amongst whites it seems that this was far less common. Consequently, particularly anxiety amongst Afrikaners, that young Afrikaner orphans would be lost to Afrikanerdom, the Dutch Reformed Church mounted a major fundraising appeal to build orphanages, £120,000. And I just to give you a sense of what that means today, that's probably 110 million rand equivalent. In 1918, the Dutch Reformed Church gathered £120,000 to accommodate flu orphans, and a large number of special orphanages were built by the Dutch Reformed Church. Other denominations followed suit, but not to the same extent. Some of you may know St. John's Hostel up in Tamborskloof, that had just opened, and as soon as it opened, the flu hit, and it doubled its capacity. Also, a number of public services of the civil servant organizations raised funds to build special orphanages. So there was a special fund for orphans of police, orphans of post office workers, and they set up a number of orphanages for these flu orphans from their particular trade. By 1926, 16 new orphanages had been erected, and a number of existing orphanages had been enlarged. Also, the state agreed to subsidize the living costs of flu orphans who were lodged in these institutions. In effect, if one were looking at the history of orphans in South Africa, the Spanish flu is an absolutely decisive dividing moment between the rather ad hoc provision of orphanages and provision for orphans before and 1918. It is a watershed and transformed the care of orphanages, particularly amongst whites, out of all recognition. If we go beyond the social consequences to the religious consequences, how do you make sense of a disaster, an all-encompassing disaster of such magnitude? Well, in 1918, the usual way was to turn to religion. But religion and religious leaders had not necessarily fulfilled the needs of those who were followers of particular religions. And so we find a number of differing religious responses depending on how worshippers, how members of particular denominations felt their religious organization had either explained or coped with or provided solace. African adherents of traditional religion, there are a significant number of examples of African adherents being attracted to Christianity because they felt that traditional religion had not adequately explained this overwhelming disaster. And so, rather insensitively, one missionary speaking of the inflow of African converts to Christianity reported on, quote, the compensating blessings accompanying the ravages of the recent influenza epidemic as seen in the awakened interest amongst the heathen, i.e. African traditional believers, and their desire for a word of God. So there clearly was a significant inflow into mainline Christian denominations by those who had felt that traditional religion did not provide an adequate explanation for a disaster of this size. On the other hand, some African Christians were disappointed by the inability of mainline Christianity to protect their families or to offer an explanation which they found adequate. And their response was to break away from mainline Christian denominations and to establish churches of their own. And so in 1918, 1919, early 1920s, there was a flowering of African-initiated churches, of Zionist churches created out of a disappointment, even discontent with the way in which mainline Christian denominations had responded. And this is not a response limited to South Africa. In West Africa, even more so, flowering of a large number of what were called Aladura churches, African-initiated churches in the Christian tradition, but very different to the mainline Christian beliefs as largely espoused by missionaries. Some very devout Christians, looking at this disaster, both black and white, went even further in trying to make sense, but within a Christian framework. Some interpreted the epidemic, Black October, as a signal that the millennium was in the offing. And they began to preach messages about the imminence of the second coming and the urgent need of people to prepare for this second coming. And a number of prophets and prophetesses, both white and black, began to preach that the second coming was imminent, that this was the sign that the millennium was upon. And you can understand, take the contemporary context. They've just had 4.5 years of World War I with the horrors which were reported, which people had read about, followed by, or almost followed by, Black October. This clearly, for many, was a sense that there was something deeper afoot, and they interpreted this as a millennial, an announcement of the millennium coming. A combination of social angst, of the feelings of everything is in disarray, produced a number of the prophets and prophetesses, some of whose churches which they established in their wake remain in existence till today. This sense of personal vulnerability, which Black October so intensified, also underlay another response, a commercial response, a response summed up in this contemporary advert. The insurance industry, having paid out a large amount of money for the deaths of policyholders, did not miss the opportunity to drive home the dangers of not having life insurance. And this is the advert which appeared in cinemas throughout South Africa at the initiative of the insurance industry. Insure your life now. And you will remember, as I think I said yesterday, the general belief was indeed from doctors that a recurrence was imminent. And so the insurance industry took advantage of this fear of the return of Black October and promoted the sale of insurance policies to very, very good effect. It was estimated that new life cover sold in 1919 was a record in percentage terms in South African history till today. It was worth £20 million then. If you multiply that today, many more millions. But it was a very successful initiative which saw insurance industries, not least of which Sanlam, which had been established in 1918, just before the flu, saw Sanlam and every other major insurance company prosper in terms of large numbers of new policyholders. The next area of consequences, and one which is very obvious, is with regard to health itself. How does a community, having come through the horrors of Black October, in which the medical profession, in which the public health department had failed so dismally, how does a society try and protect itself against a recurrence? And remember, this recurrence is something which was very much in everyone's mind. Well, the most urgent was the need for a comprehensive system of public health to take responsibility for the general health of the whole of the country. As I mentioned yesterday, in 1918, the Department of Health, well, there wasn't even a Department of Health, it was a sub-department of health, it was a sub-department of the Department of the Interior, consisted of 3 men and 2 secretaries. I think I left out the secretaries yesterday in Pretoria. This clearly was shown up to be hopelessly inadequate. And so very, very high priority given to trying to establish some kind of overarching public health body which would take responsibility and have the means to implement that responsibility. And so the Black October drove home one of the great failures, one of the great gaps of the creation of union in 1910. Because when union had been established in 1910, no attention at all had been given to health matters. There was no talk of creating a health department. There was no initiative. And in the years after 1910, there were 3 attempts made to establish a public health department, but each one of them failed because of vested interests. Well, what Black October did was to say, this cannot continue. And so early in 1919, a public health bill was introduced into Parliament, literally very hastily put together. And because of the urgency, because of the fear of the return of Black October, it went through Parliament in double quick time. The Public Health Act of 1919 was South Africa's founding Public Health Act. It's exactly 100 years ago from where we are now. The bill was introduced late January 1919. We're exactly 100 years from there. And that was enacted by May 1919, and that produced, for the first time, an overarching public health department with a Minister of Public Health for the first time. In the words of the government law advisor, he said that during the debates on the bill, which continued from January into February and March, the experience of Black October has, quote, induced a spirit of compromise both in and out of Parliament, a spirit which it is doubtful would have existed except for the remembrance of what the public suffered during the epidemic. The new Public Health Department very quickly tried to, in a sense, focus on the loopholes and the gaps in the public health system which had seen the flu brought in by sea. Immediately they sent out messages saying that every ship that had a radio on board had to radio in advance if there was any outbreak of any infectious disease, particularly influenza, on its voyage to South Africa. It also insisted that every country from which a ship departed for South Africa had to send by telegraph a indication of any epidemic raging in that country, in a sense to try and prevent the kind of easy move into South Africa which Black October, which influenza had had. And then in 1920, when the new League of Nations set up its own International Bureau of Public Health, South Africa was one of the very first members, and this opened it to a network of information being gathered together in Geneva and then sent out to all members. If, despite these attempts to try and keep the flu out by monitoring closely the arrival of ships which might be carrying infectious disease, if these measures were not successful, then further measures were introduced to try and limit any outbreak if it did occur. The local authorities were pressed all the time by the new Department of Public Health to introduce emergency plans. What are you going to do if there's an outbreak? What do you need? What equipment do you need? What space do you need? What temporary hospitals? And so Department of Public Health kept pressing municipalities along the way. And also NGOs began to recognize the enormous inadequacy or inability of the general population to cope with any outbreak. And so they began to push courses in basic nursing and first aid. The Afrikaner community in particular published manuals on basic nursing, on basic health measures, which were meant to cope with, to curb any outbreak should it happen. And then, in political terms, what were the consequences of Black October? The recognition was that underlying the high mortality was very inadequate socio-economic living conditions. That for many town dwellers in particular, the house visits conducted during Black October, when people went around with soup or with lemons or to try and provide some kind of basic nursing, opened the eyes of many to the very, very miserable living conditions of large components of particularly the urban population. And this drove home to government the need, especially a government which was very sensitive to issues regarding white health, the need for socio-economic upliftment of various kinds to try and improve the general living conditions. But also they recognized, and Black October had made this very, very clear indeed, that the health conditions of one component of the population did not exist on some island. As one leading churchman in Cape Town warned, germs recognize no colour bar, a point taken by the authorities. In Cape Town and Bloemfontein, which were two of the most up and doing municipalities in South Africa, housing plans were introduced to build houses for poorer residents on a large scale. Eventually, central government in 1920 recognized the importance of supporting the construction of large numbers of houses or adequate housing to counter the poor living conditions. And so in 1920, very much a direct consequence of the flu, South Africa's first Housing Act was passed. And that's significant because it really lays a principle, the acceptance of a principle, that housing is a state responsibility. That's the first time that a central government in South Africa actually accepted that principle and built it into policy. And so from the 1920 Act, a central housing board was established to try and provide funding for local authorities that they could build housing for particularly working class people. The private sector recognized too that housing in healthy sanitary conditions was in its interests as well. Its workers, its customers, all needed to live in conditions which would be a huge improvement on what Black October had shown up. Led by a donation of £10,000 by the president of the Cape Chamber of Commerce, a man called Richard Stutterford, a plan was devised by the Chamber of Commerce to construct a healthy, uncongested, sanitary garden city for middle-income Cape Townians, which became Pinelands. The origins of Pinelands lie very much in a response to the conditions shown up so starkly by Black October. Moreover, the Cape Times, recognizing that poor living conditions, living in stuffy, overcrowded homes, stunted children's health, made them more vulnerable. The Cape Times initiated a fund to provide bungalows at the seaside where poor children could go for a holiday. And that's the origin in 1919 of the Cape Times Fresh Air Fund, which continues till today, bungalows down at Seaforth, I think it is, down at Seaforth. very much a response to what had been shown up by Black October. Nor with the recognition that germs know no colour bar, nor was the health of urban Africans ignored, but it was focused on in a particular way, given the fears and anxieties of white South Africans. Their response was, yes, Africans are an essential component of the urban population, but we fear ill health amongst them may be transmitted to us. You remember I talked about epidemics, and epidemics always are the blame there. So for the South African state, in the wake of Black October, housing for Africans was essential, but it should be segregated. It should be separate from white areas. And so a host of African townships were set up around cities of South Africa in the wake of Black October with this idea in mind. Langa, Batu outside Bloemfontein, the Western Native Township outside Johannesburg were all townships, African townships, set up in response to this recognition that the health of urban Africans had to be looked after, but with the white mindset, they should be separate. In a sense, that was a preventive measure, preventing the epidemic or any epidemic spreading. This was finally pulled together in 1923 when the so-called Natives Urban Areas was passed, which laid down a basic framework for the housing of Africans in segregated townships around the country. In the words of the Prime Minister, General Smuts, introducing the bill in 1923, he said, if the principles of this bill were fairly applied in South Africa, we should remove what was today a grievance and a menace to health and decent living in this country. In this, as in so many other epidemics in South African history, the Spanish flu acted in two ways. It acted as an accelerator of trends, of moves already beginning to take place. For instance, the creation of a public health system, moves, as I said, 3 failed attempts had already been tried. This Spanish flu clinched it and saw the public health department set up in double quick time. It hastened the construction of hospitals which had been on the planning, which had been planned for a long time, which had been on the drawing board for ages. It developed the popular health education. It showed an attempt to deal with poor whites by providing housing, by looking after flu orphans. It certainly fostered the spread of Christianity and the independent African churches. But it also was not just an accelerator of trends, it also clearly was an initiator of developments which really hadn't been on the cards, hadn't been on the drawing board before. This clearly relates to the way in which South Africa's population changed significantly in terms of the loss of lives. That's something which worked its way through the whole South African population pyramid right through until the 1960s and 1970s. That was wholly new and unanticipated. The bereft and broken families, no way in which that was anticipated, but the generations of flu orphans lived with the consequences of that, both economic, both psychological, emotional, and likewise widowers and widowers. The flu survivors themselves who retained some physical consequences, psychological impact, emotionally scarred for the rest of their lives. The Spanish flu was both, as I say, an accelerator and an initiator. And in that sense, it has some striking parallels to the impact of war on society. But there's a very, very large difference. War, until then, was largely something which focused on those in uniform. The Spanish flu knew no bounds. In the words of a 90-year-old woman whom I interviewed, who lived in Kimberley, in that hellhole of Kimberley in October 1918, she said, "I don't hope for anything like that flu again. That's worse than a war." And so we come to the question about memory, or the lack of memory of the epidemic. It is striking. A number of people have raised questions here and spoken to me individually about how come the Spanish flu is forgotten? How come it's not there prominently in our history books, in our national memory? There are a couple of reasons that I can suggest. The one is, very obviously, that it was overshadowed by the end of World War I, and that it itself was of relatively brief duration. 3 weeks, 4 weeks of horror, of intense horror, but that's it. And I think, secondly, the Spanish flu has nothing heroic to remember about it. World War I, there is heavy emphasis on brave and courageous, largely men, giving up their lives in the interests of some higher cause. In the case of Spanish flu, there is no higher cause. The Spanish flu was an utter defeat for the state. It was an utter defeat for the medical profession. I think also, and this begins to point a finger at who writes history, who sets down what should be remembered, that in the years after 1918, the canons of what constitutes history were largely ones which emanated from the Northern Hemisphere, from Europe and from North America. And historians elsewhere followed those trends. And you will remember from what I've said that the Spanish flu, though widespread in Europe and North America, did not have anything like the devastating impact which it had, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and India. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who had lived, historians who had lived through World War I, by the 1920s, books began to appear on World War I. But they'd also lived through the Spanish flu, but there are no accounts of that. And so where do we find memories of the Spanish flu? We find them consequently not at a state level, not in an educational system, but largely at an individual, private and family level. Many families retain memories of stories told by parents, grandparents, great-grandparents of someone who had died in the flu. And I think there are a couple of ways in which the Spanish flu has been remembered. First of all, in words. Here is the program from March 1919 for a commemorative service in Frankfurt, a little village in the Free State. And here you can see a very long program to commemorate those who had died in the flu, with wreaths, with songs, with tributes aplenty. So that's one way in which the Spanish flu immediately was recognized in the words of those who had lived through it and wrote it down. The second and very obvious way is in gravestones, individual family gravestones. Here is a gravestone from Cradock in the Eastern Cape to two brothers, Gebroeders Botha, two Botha brothers of the farm Doornhoek, who died on the Spaanse griep, the Spanish flu, 25 October 1918. And so in cemeteries around the country, you will find very, and here's that word which I've used several times in this course, poignant recollections of young adults who had died in the Spanish flu. You'll go to Voltemade Cemetery in Cape Town, you'll find a significant number of them. But they are individual. There's no general monument. There's a third way in which the Spanish flu is remembered. I suppose this is in stone, a memory in words, a memory in stone. Also in stone, there are a very small number. I know of only 4 in South Africa, memorials to Spanish flu victims or those who indeed did do heroic work. This is in the Municipal Library in Port Elizabeth, commemorating here the names of about 8 or 10 people who died in the flu in the course of ministering to others. And then finally, from everything that I've said, it's remembered by people who lived through it, and that's very much the content of this book. Those are the interviews which I did. But in the course of those interviews, I also discovered that there was another way in which the Spanish flu left its imprint on memory, and that is in melody. And to really conclude this section, I actually have found the music of 2 songs to commemorate the Spanish flu. One of them is a treurstück, a lament, a tragic piece for piano called Zwart Oktober, Black October 1918, in memory of our loved ones who died during the flu, a treurstück for piano by Maria Marais, published in Craddock in 1918 or early 1919. And amazingly, I was able to find the music for that. And it seemed to me that there could be no better opportunity than this to actually play that music. And so very, very generously, we have in our midst the Professor of Primary Healthcare at UCT, but it's not because of his medical abilities that I've invited him along. Professor Steve Reed is also a very fine pianist, and he is going to perform, probably for the first time ever in public, this piece, Zwart Oktober. Those of you who come to the book launch in the quad at lunchtime at 1 o'clock, he's going to play that again. That will probably be the last public performance of this work. So, Steve, over to you. You'll say a few words. I did say that there would be a 4th member of our team non-speaking. Well, in fact, he will say a little bit about this piece and then play it, and then I'll play you the second memory in melody. Steve.
Thank you. This music is obviously amateur music. It's not a fine composition by any means. And we don't know who Mrs. Marais was, but she was obviously very sad. And ironically, the music is very jolly. So maybe she was remembering times past when people were alive. And it does go on a bit, but there are 5 sections, and the last one of the 5 sections is rather ethereal, maybe thinking about the spirits of those who've passed on. So I'll do my best for Mrs. Marais' efforts, as amateur as they were.
Here is the world premiere. Thank you very much, Steve. The second piece is a choral piece written by one of the pioneering, probably the pioneering African composers, Ruben Khaluza, originally from Natal. And it's called quite simply Influenza, written for his choir and to commemorate the disaster of the flu. It's written in isiZulu, and the words are in isiZulu, but I'll give you a translation. It is extremely fortunate that in 1930, Ruben Khaluza took his choir. They were largely trainee teachers, not professional singers, trainee teachers, to London at the invitation of HMV to come and record a whole array of his songs. And by very good fortune, UCT Music Library has a CD of this 1930 recording, which was reissued in the 1980s. His choir was called Double Quartet. And I'm going to play for you, those are the words in isiZulu. And if the technicians are with us, there we go.
1980, Sino